Table view talents, we're going to work with multiple view controllers in this video. We're going to learn about navigation controllers, the view controller stack, segues, specifically show segues and present modally segues, static table view controllers, canceling to return to the previous view controller. You'll learn about bar button items and the identity inspector. We'll also update the EU challenge project with everything we've learned in this video. Ready for table view goodness? Buckle up. All right, table view talent. So this is where we're headed after the end of this video. Our table view has a navigation bar up top. That's where the plus button is. You're going to be able to click and get into a second view controller that we're going to set up. Your cancel button will be working, and you'll also be able to click on the plus button. And notice that the add button slides the view controller up from the bottom. That's standard iOS behavior. So let's see how we can do it. Let's get at it. So the first step up to be able to get the toolbar up top, that's referred to as a navigation bar. We simply click on our view controller on our main storyboard, and then we go over under Edit, and we say Embed in a Navigation Controller. And what we'll see is this other view controller shows up here. Now this isn't like the view controllers that we've been working with, because you're not going to drag interface elements from the library and place them into this rectangle. Now you can click on the navigation controller's dock and then on the attributes inspector and see that there are some attributes for you to change. But for the most part, this rectangle that we see on screen that says navigation controller represents that the navigation controller will be a container that'll hold other view controllers. Now the series of view controllers that are considered to be embedded in the navigation controller will have this space up top to hold what's called a navigation item. It's the navigation bar where you might see the back button on some apps. It can also hold some special buttons called bar button items. Now also note that the navigation controller has this arrow pointing to it. That corresponds to, when we click on the navigation controller, this element over here in the attribute inspector that says it is the initial view controller. That says this is where your app is going to begin. Now be careful, just to show you what's going to happen, I'm going to click off its initial view controller. The arrow goes away, there's no entry point for my app, so when I build and run, and if your app doesn't have a start location, what you'll see is a black screen. I've seen students do this by accident, so if you ever see the black screen, check to see if you've got an initial view controller set. I'll click back on main storyboard and click to add initial view controller again. You can also click this arrow and drag it around, so be careful with that too. And now we're going to add a new scene to our app. So what I'm going to do is click on library, and then up top, I'll type in table, and the element I'm going to select is this yellow one that says table view controller. Now any of the user interface objects that are inside of a yellow circle like this will create a rectangle that represents a view controller if you drag this onto your canvas. So that's what we're going to do for start. We're going to grab this yellow one, table view controller. I'm going to plop it just to the right of our to-do list view controller. Now I'm going to click on the table view part and take a look what's in the attributes inspector. Now I'd previously said never use the yellow table view controller that we just dragged over here if you want to create a table view with scrollable table view cells. Those are called dynamic cells. So what we did in the prior video was we took a new view controller, not a table view controller, and we put a table view inside it. Now in this case, we want to use a table view controller. And the reason for that is because we're going to switch up here under table view where it says content from dynamic prototypes to static cells. Static cells is going to allow us a form style input. And the reason why this is important is it's going to give us a feature automatically without us having to do any coding. You see, sometimes you'll build an app that has an interface that's so complex it won't all fit on the screen. And that's going to be the case with our to-do app, especially if we run it on a smaller device like an iPhone SE. If I go down here into the notes area and click, and my app is showing the keyboard, it would otherwise obscure what's in the notes area. But what the table view controller will allow us to do is it'll allow us to set up an input area that we can scroll, and it will scroll up automatically if the keyboard was going to obscure stuff on our screen. So we want this to happen automatically. This is going to be what we're going to get by using a table view controller. And bonus, this extra feature comes without having to write any additional code. Now another thing to notice when we're looking at our running app, we actually have three distinct input areas here. There's one where we enter the name of the to-do item, another where we can set the date or time for a reminder, and the third is down here in the notes area. What we're going to do is we're going to treat those as what are called three separate sections with one table cell each, and we'll set that up right now. Now in the table view attribute inspector, it currently says sections is 1. We'll change this, but not yet. Move your cursor over to the table view controller and click on the gray area just above the 3 white cells. You'll see the attribute inspector will change and it'll say table view section. Then change the number of rows from 3 down to 1. You'll see now there's only 1 row in the highlighted section. Next, click the gray area below the table view section and you'll see the table view attributes inspector will show up again. Then go up to where it says sections and change that from 1 to 3. And if you didn't notice, when you make these changes, they show up in the document outline to the left as well. You'll see you get 3 sections with 1 row each. Now let's change the section titles. I'm going to click on this first section, and I'm going to click in the area that says Section-1. That's the section header title. And And I'm just going to type over that to-do item, and I'll press enter. Now I'm going to click in the gray table view area down below all 3 sections. Notice I'm back in the table view attribute inspector, and there's an attribute up here that says style that allows me to select a table view style. Right now I'm in the plain area that allows me to do upper lowercase. It's in sort of a bold font. If you select group, the header titles change to uppercase, the background becomes white. Inset group has titles that are uppercased as well, but the background is gray and the cells themselves are indented a little bit. Let's select grouped. I'll delete the header for the second section, and I'll put notes in the third header section. Now in this first cell, let's add a text field for input. So click Library, type in text, select text field, drag it over and plop it right into the first cell. I'll center the text field vertically, drag the edges to the margins. Then in the size inspector, I'll set auto resizing like this: top, bottom, left, right, and expanding horizontally in the middle. Let's add a text view, not a text field, in the notes area in this third section. So I'm going to click in the cell. Notice that it says table view cell. I can click to drag here, but I'm going to set the row height to 200. That's right in the size inspector. Then I'm going to go into my library, and under text, you see that I have text view. Now, if I click on the show detail icon in the upper right-hand corner, my library expands and I can get some more detail on the text view. But the thing to know about the text view that's most important is it'll allow multiple lines of scrollable entry. That'll be great for notes. So we'll just drag the text view over, plop it inside of notes, drag the top and bottom of the text view even with the cell, and put the left and right sides on the margins. By the way, you get all of this weird text that says lorem ipsum in here. This is just placeholder text to give you a sense of what a lot of text will look like in the text view. Little bit of trivia, this text has actually been used for over 4 centuries. It's sort of nonsensical, scrambled pseudo-Latin that's been placeholding text since the age of old typesetting machines. And now we're using it in apps. We're eventually going to delete it. So with that Gutenberg-style salute to nonsense Latin, we're going to set the auto resizing for the text view, and you can click all the lines outside and inside. Then I'm going to click on the middle section here. That's going to hold our date picker. So I'm going to click on size inspector and adjust the cell height to 200. Then I'll bring up the library. I'll type picker into the object filter. You'll see 2 different pickers in here, a generic picker view, but we want the date picker. That's going to be specifically configured to allow us to pick dates and times. So drag this over, size it to the edges. We actually don't even need to have the bottom anchored because everything else is going to hold. You can click to view as different size devices just to make sure everything is good, and it looks great. So now we're going to add a transition so that when you click on a specific cell in our scrollable table view, it's going to open up the table view controller. Now these screen-to-screen transitions are called segues. We're going to initially set things up to demonstrate how they work, and then we're going to undo some of the things that we set up as we learn more about segues. That'll help you really understand these concepts. Now I want to be able to click on a cell in the to-do list view controller, and I want that to transfer me over to the new table view controller. So the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to find in the document outline, in the to-do list view controller, the single cell. I'm going to control click on the word cell here, drag over into the new view controller, and let go. This little black widget will pop up here, and under selection segue, I want you to select show, not show detail, but just show. And this is going to create the transition where it will slide over our new view controller from left to right on top of the old one. See this arrow that was created? That's our segue. See how there's a circle in the middle of the arrow? Click that. It gets highlighted in blue. I'm going to go up under the attributes inspector, and you see how it now says storyboard segue. These are the attributes for that segue. You'll notice that the kind down here says show, and there's also an attribute that says identifier. Identifier, hey, we've seen that before. Now remember how we typed in CELL for the cell identifier, and this allowed us to refer to that cell in our code? Well, we're going to give an identifier name to the segue. Let's type in show detail, upper camel case, press enter, and you know what? Let's build and run and see what this bad boy does. All right, build successfully. Notice that we've got 3 view controllers on our main storyboard. Although we won't see the navigation controller as a formal view controller, it's just a container for the other ones. I'm going to click on change the world, and boom, there goes our show segue sliding over the table view controller from left to right. Slick. And we also get that back button. Let's click on that. We're back to the original table view. Let's click on take a vacation. That slides over too. Of course, it is no time for a vacation because there are still apps to build. Now, we're not passing over data yet, but we do have segues. Now, I want to show you this keyboard feature as well. Now, first, there's a good chance that your keyboard isn't going to show in the simulator if you click on the field or the text view, but we can fix it. You can go up under here in hardware, select keyboard, and then toggle software keyboard. And by the way, Command K will also toggle the keyboard from showing to not showing. By the way, if you're ever working on your app and what you type into the Mac isn't showing up in the iOS simulator, you can do the Shift Command K or Connect Hardware keyboard as well. That acts as a toggle. Then let's click down here into the notes area. We should see the keyboard show up. Again, you can Command K if it's not showing up. but we see we get this wonderful scrolling that we promised you with the table view controller. Nice. And now just to point out a few interface guidelines. What I've done is I've launched Apple's Contacts app in my simulator. And I can click on any of these fake contacts here, and I can see that I do my show segue, which transitions from left to right, sliding on top of what you can envision as a stack of view controllers. I can click on the back button to go back. But what happens if I want to add a contact? Watch what happens when I click on plus. It slides up this add screen up from the bottom. Now I don't have that back contacts button up in the navigation controller area. Instead, I have a cancel button and a save button. The reason I don't have that back button is that this view controller that slid up from the bottom is not embedded in the navigation controller, and it's not part of that same stack of the original view controllers. You might have also noticed that starting in iOS 13, view controllers that do this are rendered on screen so that they look like they kind of hover over the existing stack of view controllers. Now this is referred to in iOS as a modal presentation. We've presented the view controller modally. And what this does is it makes sure that the user makes a discrete choice, either cancel or save. And that's the standard when you're adding data to an app. You can open up some of Apple's other apps like Calendar, you'll see the same thing. So to get this kind of behavior, we need to add a plus button on our first view controller and then implement one of these modal segues. And we're going to do that now. So I'm going to stop the app from executing in the simulator. I'm on main storyboard, into the object library, and I'm going to type button into the search area. We see a bunch of different options up here. I don't want to use a standard button though. The kind of buttons that go in the navigation item, that navigation bar area at the top, are bar button items. So select that, drag it over, and I'm going to plop it to the right-hand side of my first view controller. That's the one with the scrollable table view cells. And make sure that you put it in the navigation item. That's this navigation bar up at the top. It shows up in the document outline. We can see that we're in the attributes inspector for a bar button item this time. Click on where it says system item. It currently says custom by default, but we want to select the option that says add. And you'll notice that it adds what looks like a plus sign in here. It's actually a special graphic image. It's a little bigger than the standard plus sign. That's what we want. Now it's segue time, and we're going to set this up wrong, and we're going to do it so we can illustrate why we need to use this other technique. But I'm going to control drag from the plus bar button item over into our new view controller. I get these different options, and remember we said we need a modal segue, so select present modally. A second arrow shows up. If I click on the circle in between that arrow, I can see its attributes in the attribute inspector. It says that its kind is present modally. That's versus if I click on the other one, it says its kind is show. And also take a look, something else is happening here. When I've clicked on the show segue, I can see that I've got the navigation item, that navigation bar area at the top of this view controller. I can see the back button, but if I click back on my present modally segue, I don't have that navigation bar area. And that's because present modally actually presents this view controller on top of the existing view controller stack. It's not slid in as part of that original view controller stack that's embedded in that first navigation controller. Now, not having its own navigation controller is going to create a problem for us. Let's build and run and see that. So here we go. I'm clicking on change the world. I'm clicking on a table view cell. What kind of segue is this going to be? Show. Slides from the side, exactly what I expect. Click on the back button. I'm back at my scrollable table view. Now let's click on plus. What kind of segue is this? Present modally. What does it do? It transitions to this new view controller by laying the view controller on top of the existing view controller stack. It's not slid in and embedded as part of that existing navigation controller structure. Well, what does that mean? Holy smokes, I'm stuck. I've got no navigation bar up top. Now with iOS 13, you can actually pull to dismiss. That's a behavior given to you by default. It acts like a cancel button. But still, I'm not getting what I want. What do I need to do? I want to add a cancel and save button up top so that I can save or cancel the entry of new data. And the way that I'm going to do that is by taking this view controller and embedding it in a separate navigation controller. And so this is what our app diagram is going to look like. You see, when you click on the table view cell, what's going to happen is we're going to get a show segue. What the show segue does is it goes from one view controller to the other view controller, pushing this new view controller onto the existing view controller stack. Now, since that view controller stack is embedded in an existing navigation controller, this new view controller that's pushed on the stack inherits its navigation item from the first navigation controller. Now, when we add, we got to present modally. We got to bubble up from the bottom. But what does present modally do? It doesn't push things onto the existing stack. Instead, it lays a view controller on top of the stack. Now, because we're laying this view controller on top of the existing stack, it doesn't have its own navigation controller. We got to give it its own. But once we do that, if we present modally from this plus button, the add button, into the new navigation controller, that navigation controller has the other view controller embedded in it. So if we go in this direction, the place where we'll put save and cancel will be inherited from this new view controller. So let's embed the table view controller inside of a navigation controller. We know how to do that. Click the table view controller, go up under the editor menu, embed in navigation controller. We see the nav controller shows up, but we got our 2 segues going into the navigation controller. That's not what we want. Deleting a segue is simple. I'm going to click on the bubble on the first segue, press the delete key, do the same for the second segue. Now I'm going to recreate my segues. First, I'll control drag from the plus button up to the new navigation controller. That's a present modally segue. Now click the bubble in the line you just drew. We need to add an identifier. So we'll go up under the storyboard segue in the attribute inspector. In identifier, we'll write add detail upper camel case. Press enter. Now let's add our show segue going from the cell in the table view to the new view controller directly, not through the nav controller. This is going to be a show segue. After the segue was created, click on that bubble in the new line, go up under storyboard segues identity inspector, and the identifier here should be show detail upper camel case. Now we're getting closer. Let me adjust some things on screen. I'll build and run, and while that's getting ready, let's take a look at main storyboard. Now let's focus on the navigation item. That's the navigation bar area in the new view controller. Let's click first on this line that goes from the new navigation controller to the new view controller. Now we didn't create this line, it was given to us when we did the embed. But when we click it, we can see what this navigation item, the navigation bar in the new view controller looks like. And we've got that navigation item, we've got the navigation bar in there. There's just nothing inside it. Let's click on the bubble in the show segue to compare it. We've got a back button in there. And you know what? We don't even want the back button because we want to be able to cancel or save when we click on a to-do item because we may be editing it. So we'll set up both a cancel and a save button, and we'll make sure these bar button items show up regardless of whether we present modally or we show. So if we look after our build and run, we can see that we've got a navigation item or a navigation bar, both when we show segue as well as when we present modally, but we need to set those buttons up. And let's head back to the main storyboard. I'll stop the app and take a look over in the document outline. I'm going to click on our add bar button item that we've set up. Look how it appears over here. So there's a navigation item, that's our navigation bar. Underneath that it says there's a left bar button item, but there's nothing in it. And in right bar button item, that's where our add button shows. Well, all right, now we know where to find these things in the doc outline. Let's click on library, drag one bar button item over to the left-hand side of our new view controller. And I'm going to plop this right on top of where the back button is because I don't want the back button anymore. And in the attributes inspector, I'll set the bar button item system item to cancel. And now library again, grab another bar button item, put it on the right side of the navigation item, and change the system item to save. Now it's not vital that you build and run here. I'll do it just so that you can see we have our save and cancel button, but nothing is working. So what we want to do is we want to create an IB action for at least the cancel button so that we can get that working and we can go back to our original table view. So I'll go back into Xcode and wait a second. If I want to create an IB action, I don't have a file yet for this new view controller. I mean, I've got a file that says to-do list view controller, but that controls this view controller. I need a file to control this other view controller. How do we do that? Well, we go under File, New, File, and we're going to say Cocoa Touch Class, and then click Next. Now, Cocoa Touch classes are all of Apple's iOS classes. Remember, we described a class as being a blueprint. Well, if you've noticed, when we're editing our Swift files, up until now, we've been editing a version of the UI view controller class. It says that right next to the class definition at the top. That means we're taking Apple's blueprint and we're customizing it or subclassing it with our own stuff. Now you see subclass in here probably says UI view controller. We're going to change it to UI table view controller, which will allow us to subclass the special blueprint for the table view controller, because that's what this new view controller is. So you can either type in UI table view controller, or you can select it from the pull down menu. We need to give the class a name. Why don't we call that to-do detail table view controller? Click on next, and the default save location is right inside your project. That's great. So just click create. Now new files are created in your Xcode project navigator just below whichever file was clicked on. So I can see I had main storyboard clicked. It put my new to-do detail view controller right underneath it. I'm going to click and drag this back up and position it right underneath my to-do view controller. I want to keep my view controller files together, starting with the first one that should be showing when I run my app. Now Xcode creates this file for us that's got a whole bunch of stuff commented out that we don't need at all. It's just getting in the way. So I want to click before just the very last curly in the class, and I'm going to scroll up until the curly that ends view did load. Shift clicking should highlight that whole area. Make sure you don't take out the last curly for view did load though. Pressing delete will clear it out of my file, and it feels good to get rid of all that junk. Marie Kondo for Xcode. I'm also going to get rid of the comments in view did load. You don't need those either. Nice and clean. Now I'm going to option click on main storyboard, so I'm in assistant editor mode, and you might think now you can just go ahead and create your IB actions, but no, we need to do a little bit more. If I control drag from my cancel button over, we see that the connection dialog doesn't let me set up any kind of actions or outlets. This is a real common error among even senior app developers, but now you'll know to recognize it. What this means is we have not yet connected the table view controller that's on our main storyboard to the new class file that we just created. Now watch this. You see how I'm hovering over the golden circle that's just above our new table view controller? It just says table view controller. It's not using the file name that we just created. That means this user interface element is not identified with our new class file. You also see the document outline has the generic name table view controller. Now let's go over and take a look at the other view controller that we have. That one says to-do list view controller, and that name also shows up in the document outline. So we see this view controller is explicitly identified with a Swift file called to-do list view controller.swift. And with this view controller selected, I'm going to go up to the inspector just to the left of the attributes inspector. It's the one that looks like a little ID card, or some people think it looks like a newspaper. That's called the identity inspector. And when you click on it, you can see that the class is to-do list view controller. That's the identity of this interface element. So let's give an identity to the new guy. I'll position the main storyboard so that I can click on the new table view controller, go up to the identity inspector. Look what happens when I pull down class. I can see under here there's the to-do detail table view controller that I just created. Xcode conveniently recognizes that I've clicked on an object of type UI table view controller, and it shows me only the subclasses of UI table view controller. There's only one. Click it, press enter, it now has an identity. Hover over the table view controller doc, and now it says to-do detail table view controller. It also says that in the doc outline. That means this user interface object is associated with the file. It says to-do detail table view controller.swift, and if we write code in that file, we'll be controlling this object. Nice work. Now look what happens when we control drag from the cancel button to create an IB action. We can create the IB action. So let's call this cancel button pressed. Let's also create an IB outlet for the save button. We don't need an action for it, but in a future video, we're going to disable or enable this depending on whether or not we have text in our to-do item field. So because we need access to the attributes, we're going to need an IB outlet. Call it save bar button. While we're here, why don't we create an IB outlet for the text field? We'll call that name field. We'll create an IB outlet for the date picker. We'll call that date picker, lower camel case. Look how the type shows up as UI date picker. And finally, we'll create an outlet for the text view that's associated with the notes, and we'll call that note view. Now I can get back into the editor mode for my Swift file, and I'm going to type in the code for cancel button pressed. Now I'll describe what's going on here, and the terms are going to seem a little unfamiliar, but what's nice is you're going to be able to reuse this in any situation when you need similar cancel button behavior. Here's the crux of what we're going to do. Depending on how a view controller was presented, we're going to use one of two different commands. For the view controllers that were presented modally, we need to use the dismiss command. For view controllers that were presented using the show segue, which pushes the view controller on the stack, we need to use a command called pop. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to check to see if the view controller that I'm looking at was presented from a navigation controller. So I'm going to set up a constant. I'm going to say let is presenting in add mode. It's going to be Boolean, true or false. And I'm going to say this equals, and I can say presenting view controller. This value shows up in code completion, and there's a description down here that says the view controller that presented this view controller. So if we look at our main storyboard, the present modally, which comes when we click on the add button, goes through the navigation controller. So the presenting view controller is the navigation controller. If it's a navigation controller, I know it was presented modally. I know I've got to dismiss. If it's false that the presenting view controller was the navigation controller, then it must be this view controller that presented it, and I know I need to pop. Now we're going to use a command we've not used before, which is, which we can use to verify the type of a value. So we're going to say presenting view controller is UI navigation controller. And just a side note, make sure you select UI navigation controller. There are a lot of things in here that start with UI navigation. You don't want to select the wrong one. If the presenting view controller is a navigation controller, we get a true in here. If not, we get a false. So we'll use this value we just created to say if is presenting in add mode, open curly, then we want to dismiss. Look at the description of dismiss in code completion. Dismisses the view controller that was presented modally by the view controller. Exactly what we want. Press return. The animated property will be true. The completion handler will be nil. Else, we're not presenting in add mode. We must have come over from that show segue. So we'll say navigation controller, make sure you select the right one, dot pop. Pop view controller will show up. Now, if we didn't present through a navigation controller, how come we typed navigation controller dot before we typed in the pop? Well, let's look what code completion says, because it pops the top view controller from the navigation stack and updates the display. Oh yeah, that's what we want to do, is we want to get the one that's on top of the stack and pop it right off. Press return. For animated, you can put true in the bool here. Now there's a lot going on in this little chunk of code. Present modally, dismiss, push, pop. The nice thing is, highlight this chunk of code. You can paste it in whenever you need this functionality. You got a software Lego. Let's build and run and see how we're looking. Click change the world, show segue, go back with a pop, click on the plus button, present modally, cancel with a dismiss. This is looking spectacular. Now it's challenge time. Do exactly what you did with this code with our Euro Swift. Modify the EU challenge project from our earlier video. Embed the existing view controller in a navigation controller. Create a new table view controller and associate this with a Swift file named detailViewController.swift. Create an interface like the one shown. Embed detail view controller in its own navigation controller. Add a bar button item to the navigation controller of the first view controller. Create two segues, a show segue from a cell in the table view to the new detail view controller, a present modally segue from the add button to the detail view controller. Add a cancel and a save bar button to the detail view controller. Create an IB action, cancel button pressed, and include code to handle canceling from the detail view controller, returning the user to the first view controller, and create IB outlets for save bar button, name field, and country field. Swifter, you're up for it. Press pause. Try it on your own. And resume. Let's see how you did. So here we are in the EU project. I'm going to go onto the main storyboard. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to embed the view controller in a navigation controller. Editor. Embed in navigation controller. Boom. Next up, I'm going to create a new table view controller. Library, table view controller. The yellow one. It plops in a full table view controller. I'm going to set this up so that it's not dynamic prototypes, it's static cells. I'm going to click on the first section up here, take my rows down to 1, click back on my table view, take my sections up to 3. I'm going to rename the first section country. I'm going to rename the second section capital. For the third one, for now, I'm just going to leave it blank. I'm going to add 2 text fields, one right here under country, another one right under capital. Stretch these out to the edges, use size inspector, adjust them up. They're looking good. Attach them to the margins and make sure they expand left and right. You can go and see how they look on an iPhone SE. Perfect. Now I'm also going to go into the table view, change the attribute style to grouped. Nice. Now let's embed the table view controller in a navigation controller, so click its dock. The editor menu, embed in, navigation controller, boom. Click on the library to add a bar button item to the first view controller. Set its system type to add. Add my segues. First present modally. Control drag from the add button. Present modally to the navigation controller. Then control drag from the cell. It's always good to click on cell in the document outline because it's easy to see. Drag directly to the new view controller, not the nav controller. Select show. Give these both names. I should have an identifier for the show segue that is show detail. I'll have an identifier for the present modal that says add detail. Upper camel case. I'm going to add 2 bar button items to the table view controller. One to the left, we'll call that cancel. One to the right, system item save. Now before I'm going to be able to create IB actions and outlets, I'm going to have to create a file for this view controller. So over in my project navigator, I'm going to click on viewcontroller.swift. That should create the file underneath after I go up to File, New, File, Cocoa Touch Class. Next, the class is going to be of type UI table view controller. Always double check this. I'm going to call this simply detail table view controller. Next, create. My new Swift file is created. I'm going to highlight all the junk I don't need. Press delete. Make sure I've got 2 closed curlies, one for the class, one for view did load. Get rid of the extra comments. Go back to main storyboard. Click on table view controller. Click on the little ID card to open up the identities inspector. And under custom class, select the new file that we just created, detail table view controller.swift. Now it's assistant editor mode, so click on detail view controller.swift, option click on main storyboard. I can control drag from my cancel bar button item, drop it one above the curly in detail table view controller, create that IB action, and call this action cancel button pressed. For a UI bar button item, connect. I'm going to control drag from my save button as well and create an IB outlet for this one. I'm going to call that save bar button. And I'll create 2 IB outlets for country field and capital field. Now I could go ahead and type code in here, but I'd mentioned what we wrote as a software Lego where we don't have to do any changes at all. So I'm going to pull up my old code. I'm going to grab the guts of this cancel button pressed, make sure I get everything in between the curlies, return to the EU project, paste. Appreciate the majesty of reusable code. Build and run. Look at all these nations. What happens if we click on Cyprus? We don't see it, but we do see that we move over here. We do our show segue, click on cancel. Let's add a nation. Maybe Scotland's going to go in there. Cancel works perfectly as well. Swifter, you are mastering table views. Keep at it.